Welcome to GeekGirlCon 2024. I am Sarah Grant. My nickname is SG1 and my pronouns are she, her. I am here with Johnnie Jae, who is one of our panelists this year for GeekGirlCon. She is here to talk with us about Indigenous horror, which is part of the title of one of her panels for us this year. Johnnie, why don't you introduce yourself to us?
Hey everyone, I'm Johnnie Jae, and I'm the founder of a tribe called Geek and Grim Native. And I am here this weekend to present Sometimes Dead is Better, to talk about Indigenous horror, and then of course I will also be doing Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse Red Style.
Excellent. That's amazing. So we have a choir warming up behind us. If you hear any of that happening, they sound amazing. But just in case you hear that, that's what's going on. So I've got a couple questions for you, Johnnie. What makes horror a unique genre to showcase Indigenous stories?
You know, I think what makes horror so unique for natives is that you don't see a lot of it in the mainstream. And a lot of that is because we have common sense. So like with a lot of horror, a lot of it is predicated on not having common sense. You run up the stairs.
Right.
You know you're not supposed to mess with something, but you go and do it anyway.
Right.
And that's not the same thing with native horror. So a lot of our horror is based on a lot of the things that we've gone through historically.
Right.
So you'll see a lot of our stories being rooted in like historical trauma, in like the residential boarding school area, and how those things haunt us still to this day.
Right.
So that's what makes our stories a little bit different, because when a lot of people see Indigenous horror, they don't always recognize it as horror,
right?
Because there's usually not a large body count. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of like overt violence, and a lot of it is more just because it's rooted in that historical trauma. It's very psychological,
right?
So a lot of people don't oftentimes like recognize it outright as horror, unless it's something like Jeff Barnaby's Blood Quantum, which deals with zombies, and then it's more familiar.
That's horrifying. Oh. What do you think? Why do you think horror is particularly powerful for exploring Indigenous experiences and perspectives? I mean, you talked a little bit about the boarding schools, which is horrifying.
Yeah, you know, well, horror has always been a mirror. You know, like when we hold up that mirror, it reflects to us like the deepest, darkest fears that we have as humanity. And it also reflects the fears that our society has about like the path that we're going down. And it also brings up like just things that are going on. You know, a lot of horror is political, and a lot of people don't always recognize that. But, you know, like when you're looking at zombies, you know, a lot of times you're talking with things of like consumerism and just, you know, like what happens when all you're doing is consuming. Right. You know, it's terrifying when you deal with the impact of that.
Yeah.
So, you know, horror is that mirror that holds it up. And so when we're holding up that mirror as Indigenous people to look at the way that the things that we've experienced have impacted our communities, we're looking at the way that that historical trauma has changed the way that we relate to each other as human beings. You know, the residential boarding school era silenced a lot of survivors.
Yeah.
Because in our communities, a lot of them believe that when you speak something, you give it power. Right. You speak that into existence. So silence was the way that a lot of survivors dealt with it. Mm-hmm. Pretend it doesn't happen, you move on. And then there were survivors who did speak out, but they were never believed. Right. And so you see that reflected in a lot of our stories about the erasure that we face, about the misrepresentation, and just all these things that we don't normally talk about, but that we're finally bringing to the surface. So, you know, I think that's what makes it so powerful, because it's forcing us to look at ourselves as more than just victims, but also as, you know, people who are also kind of complicit in this by allowing each to silence each other. By allowing us to be invisible or to not want to talk about things because it makes us uncomfortable. And so it kind of allows us to confront that and really reconcile with, you know, the things that we've gone through, but also the way that we also contribute to that pain in various ways.
So what do you think are some common misconceptions about Indigenous horror that maybe need to be addressed?
that it's not horror.
Oh, well, yeah.
You know, I think that's the biggest misconception, because a lot of Indigenous horror, there's like a very fine line between like dark fiction and horror, and Indigenous horror is right on that line.
Got it.
Because it deals with that historical trauma, because it is more psychological, because it's sometimes, you know, really just us kind of like putting out there like what's going inside of us, like
Right.
the struggles that we're facing. So I think that's something that people need to realize, like, yeah, you know, it's horror, just not horrifying to you because that's not a history that you're familiar with or something that you've experienced. Like, people talk about the residential boarding schools, and to them, when they hear boarding schools, they think of rich kids being sent to these posh schools, getting a
Right.
great education. Whereas for us, these were places where our children went and their hair was cut. The connection that they had to their family was erased. A lot of them had their names taken away and they were just given numbers. And even now, we're starting to find mass graves at the sites of these residential boarding schools.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the residential boarding schools, and because we know that history, and because it's our grandparents, it's, you know, our aunts and uncles, it wasn't something that happened like centuries ago.
Right.
And it's over with. You know, this is something that is still very recent and has a very recent impact on us. So, you know, it's things like that to realize, like, yes, you know, it may not be horrifying to you, but when we watch it, it is horrifying to us because that is part of our history. Like, those are our scary stories, our
Right. I think stories like that would be horrifying to anyone.
yeah.
Watching. Yeah. Yeah. No matter who's watching them. So, how would you envision the future of Indigenous horror? Are there any particular stories or themes you would hope to see explored?
Yes, you know, I'm super excited about Indigenous horror because we're having like a renaissance right now. Like, there's so many novels that are coming out that are just absolutely fantastic. You know, I can't say enough about Stephen Graham Jones, because he's one of the native writers who's really been able to transcend into the mainstream to where he is known as a horror writer, not a native horror writer.
Oh, cool.
And that's because his stories, like, they are native, but they're so universal. And so people don't always recognize those characters as being native because, you know, they could fit themselves into it. They can relate to those situations. So I can't say enough about him. And he has so much work. I cannot keep up.
Okay.
But I also think that what I'd like to see going forward is just being able to see us not being afraid to tackle stories. You know, there's so many different things that are taboo in our cultures. For example, like the Navajo, they have skinwalkers. And we've really seen non-natives taking that and running with it in ridiculous ways. Like, we have people who are ghost storytellers on TikTok and everything claiming that they've seen skinwalkers in Alabama. And it's like, there's no Navajo in Alabama, you know?
Right.
So it's like being able to take those stories and share our perspectives in the way that they were meant to be. And really kind of, because they're terrifying. But with what happens is a lot of non-natives take those stories because they're scary and they add their own spin on it, thinking like, oh, I'm doing this something, but they lose the point of it. And when you disconnect it from the culture and the meaning and the impact that these stories and these figures have, you know, you lose that terrifyingness. And so they kind of just come off corny.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to see us being able to tackle those, and trying to remove that stigma that comes with them and just being able to be allowed more creative freedom.
Cool. That's awesome. So, other than Stephen Graham Jones, do you have any other recommendations that you would have for our viewers, like in terms of movies, books, TV shows?
Yes, you know, I think for people who are just getting into Indigenous horror, a good place to start is with Jeff Barnaby. You know, he passed away recently, but his films are legacy. And they've inspired like a whole new generation of horror creatives. But like his Blood Quantum and Rhymes for Old Young Ghouls, you know, those are two very iconic movies that I think everybody should start with because they really give you a glimpse of how we view the residential boarding school era and also zombies. And it tackles issues of like Indigenous identity in such a beautiful way. As far as books, you know, there's Never Whistle at Night, which I cannot get through the audiobook. I've read the book.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, this is scary. But hearing it audio, and I think it's because natives are such oral storytellers
Yeah.
that it just makes it even creepier. Like I still haven't, I'm only halfway through. And every time I listen, I'm just like, oh my God, no.
Too creepy.
Too creepy.
Oof.
And then of course, you know, there's just so many, you know, there's a book by Richard Van Camp that's being re-released called Beast. And I'm super excited for that because the cover is absolutely beautiful for a horror novel. It's like, who said a cover could be that beautiful? But, you know, I'm super excited for that. You know, there's just so much going on. And if you follow Grim Native, I'm going to be highlighting all of that.
Excellent. Awesome. So do you have like a favorite movie ever?
Halloween.
Halloween?
I recently won an argument that Halloween is the most indigenous horror movie that's not an indigenous horror movie.
Really? Why is that?
Because when you really look at the story of Halloween, it's about historical trauma. Because you have a young girl who is being tortured by a boogeyman.
Yeah.
And that boogeyman doesn't have a voice. So it literally could be anyone or anything.
Okay.
And when you look at this new trilogy, you know, they brought it back in 2018. And the whole trilogy that comes next shows what happened. How did that event impact the rest of her life? And it shows what it did to her, what it did to her daughter and her granddaughter, and how they're dealing with it in various ways. And then when you move on to Halloween Kills, you're looking at how that trauma impacted an entire community. How did it change the way that they view and relate to each other? And then when you get to Halloween Ends, you're looking at how do you heal from that trauma while still being traumatized in various ways, whether it's, you know, like Michael Myers coming back, or whether it's dealing with community, the anger that they have for you because they think you're to blame for it. So then you also have, okay, how do we heal from this? Like, and how do we confront this monster? And they do, and they kill it. But, you know, there's a point where Allison's like, you know, it's not over. Like, we, you know, nobody's going to believe this. And so the ending of Halloween Ends, you know, they parade his body through town so people can see that he's gone, that he's dead.
Right.
And they destroy the body so that nobody will have any residual fear. Like, they have to confront the fact that he's gone. So now we have to move forward. And so I think it's a beautiful way to look at historical trauma. So, and he's always been my favorite.
Yeah.
And now I know why.
Okay. All right. Well, I think I have some movies to watch. Sounds like, because I haven't seen those last three movies.
Let me tell you, I saw Halloween 2008, 18, and I was looking forward to him, right? Then the pandemic happened and everything got pushed back.
Yeah.
And I was just like, okay, if I do not make it, if I do not survive this pandemic to see Halloween Kills, you guys better riot, because nobody else is going to see it either. And then I saw it, and it broke my heart because I saw what they wanted to do. It just didn't land.
Yeah.
So then, you know, it broke my heart. But then they came back with Halloween Ends, and people hated it, and I loved it.
Oh.
So, but I mean, it's such a good way when you look at it through the lens of like historical trauma and healing from that. You know, it works.
I'm so glad you got to see the end of it.
Me too.
Yes.
Me too.
And I'm so glad you're here again this year for GeekGirlCon.
Yes, you know, this is always my favorite con to come to, just because like the community is just so awesome.
Yeah, we love it here. We're going to keep doing it as long as we possibly can. We love it here too. So thank you again, Johnnie, for doing this with us, and for I get to meet you again. Again for the first time finally. Offline, yes, wonderful. So up next with us at 4:30, we have a performance by the video game choir Level Up. Afterwards, join us back here for a fun and exciting Lego showcase with the Women's Brick Initiative. And we are just about done. So thank you very much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your con weekend. Thanks so much.